I'm going to be talking a little bit about State of Rural, and this is an annual report we put out every year. So let's start with labor force issues, because this is where it all stems from. This is why we're going to be talking more and more about the need for people. We're Minnesotans, right? So we like to brag a little bit. I teach a class at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and it's funny, I have a couple students that are not from Minnesota. They're from other regions of the United States, and it's funny, they all comment that there is an absolute obsession among Minnesotans for the state of Minnesota, and I think it's probably pretty true. But let's break here just a little bit. So Minnesota, typically since the 1970s, has had the top 5 lowest unemployment rate. It's also had the top 5 highest labor force participation rate. It's typically the top performing state during recessions, and this goes back many, many years since the 1970s. During the Great Recession in the 2008 to 2012, we were consistently top 1, 2, 3 states in the nation performing in the economic system, even though it was a downturn in our economy. And even during the pandemic, we continued to have the lowest unemployment rate and do quite well. I bring up this because the other thing that's really important about Minnesota is we have the 5th most diverse economy in the United States. And that's really important. And having the 5th most diverse economy is what helps us really stay stable and smooth out all of the kind of severe lows and the increasing highs, right? Like we're pretty just we really just kind of hone in and staying in the middle, and it makes us quite resilient. I bring this up because you do not have the 5th most diverse economy without rural Minnesota. And so if you ever need to make an argument about why rural areas are important in our state, here's a really good economic reason. It creates diversity in the economy, and so when there are downturns, which usually impacts certain aspects of our economy, our labor force, or industry, we have other industries to help hold up and continue to make the tax rolls for our state. And so that's what makes Minnesota pretty unique in that sense. So what may threaten our awesomeness? And this is really it. And this is, if you talk to the state demographer, if you talk to any kind of experts in the field, they're going to tell you that the lack of people is probably the biggest issue we have facing us over the next 15 to 20 years. Our labor force growth has been decreasing for 2 decades. And actually, I'll show you a chart that it actually decreased for the first time in modern history during the pandemic. We're pretty terrible at keeping our youth right now. And even though we talk a lot about this being an issue in rural areas, it's also a statewide issue. Twin Cities loses a lot of its youth as well, but they just happen to get a lot more in-migration of young people. And the third thing is immigration policy. And this isn't something we talk a lot about at the Center for Rural Policy Development because immigration policy is very federally focused, and we don't do federal policy analysis at the Center for Rural Policy Development. But I do want to keep it in here because it is an important piece, and it has been a history of our state that has been an important piece that has allowed for economic growth in Minnesota. For some of you, just thinking back to the early 1900s, there were cities such as Hibbing and Chisholm, and other places in southwest Minnesota where 60 to 70% of their population was foreign-born in the early 1900s. And so immigration has been a pretty big aspect of our resiliency in the past. So we're going to talk about 2 things, and I think this is interesting because everybody always has the argument, yeah, our unemployment rates are so low. And then somebody will pipe up and be like, oh, that's because everybody's dropping out of the labor force, and everybody kind of fights about this. The fact of the matter is that both things play a role in this, both unemployment and people dropping out of the labor force. And so if anybody's interested, this kind of unemployment side here, you can see you can be unemployed as well as be participating in the labor force. And that means you're on layoff, awaiting recall, or actively looking and available for work. So let's talk about that first. I'm going to show you a couple of charts. Here's the schematics, the color schematics that I'm going to use, so you kind of get a sense. These are pretty big areas. But even among EDRs and counties, these trends do follow pretty closely. So here's the unemployment rate going back to 2001. And as you can see, pretty stable 2001 to 2006. Huge spike during the Great Recession there. And then a gradual recovery. And then a huge spike during the pandemic, obviously. And then just complete bottom falls out, where right now we are at the lowest unemployment rates in modern history in the state of Minnesota, anywhere from 2% to 3%. These are historic lows across Minnesota. If you wanted to look at it by county, this is what it would look like. And as you can see, this is pretty typical in Minnesota, where the southern half has the lowest unemployment rates and the northern half has the highest. Now, this has nothing to do with there being more unemployed folks in northern Minnesota, but rather this is more related to seasonal labor and seasonal workforce. You just have more jobs available, particularly spring, summer, and fall, than you may have in the winter. And so some folks are on layoff, waiting recall, at a higher proportion in northern Minnesota, which just increases the annual unemployment rate. But again, these are super, super low unemployment rates for our counties. So we have historically low unemployment rates. So let's talk about the labor force. Did we have people, how many are coming in? Because these two things are tied. This is a little bit of a crazy chart. So let me break it down for you. And we'll start with Northwest Minnesota here. And then you can see in 2012 to 2013, Northwest Minnesota actually lost. They had 882 fewer people participating in the labor force. The next year, they actually gained 1,000, and then 3,600 the following year, 1,200. And you can see pretty good gains, a couple of losses. And then the bottom drops out here during the pandemic in 2021 where they lost 8,300. By 2022, a little bit of a recovery of 1,300. Now this red box shows us kind of the overall change. If I were to sum up all of these changes, essentially what this says is in 2022, Northwest Minnesota had about 2,000 more people participating in the labor force than they did in 2012. That's not a huge amount. Over the course of 10 years, Northwest only has 2,000 more people participating in the labor force. Unfortunately, that's actually better than places such as Southwest Minnesota down here in the bottom left corner, where you can see since 2012, Southwest is actually operating in 2022 with 10,000 less people participating in the labor force. And these aren't because there are no jobs available. This is literally because of demographic change. We just have a lot of people retiring. They're turning 55, 60 and leaving the labor force. And when we talk about who dropped out of the labor force, particularly in rural areas, we saw the significant drops among individuals 55 plus and women that were participating in the labor force. And we saw drops in the labor force across all age cohorts and genders, but these two in particular hit the hardest in our rural areas. So why leaving the labor force? So the biggest thing I'll just say before I drop into these four is that demographic changes. We are going to be struggling with labor force change and drops in our labor force for a long time because we have a lot of people that are reaching retirement age over the next 10 years. And the pandemic really accelerated that. So people that were maybe 60, they wanted to retire when they were 65. The pandemic came and maybe they decided, 60 is old enough. I'm leaving the labor force. So we saw a lot of that. But then there's all these other factors that are playing a role in this as well. We've seen research and anecdotal evidence to point to childcare being a significant issue. The lack of childcare access, making some of the spouses stay home and take care of the kids. Some of them, maybe homeschooling or the switch to online classes. Maybe it means they stay home and not go to work. Fear of COVID-19, this was particularly relevant for folks that were 55 and up. And it could have been, obviously it hit that age cohort pretty hard. But it could also been they didn't want to wear the mask or they had respiratory issues. Like there's a lot that went into that particular age cohort that went up. Cultural changes at work. So this probably doesn't get talked about enough. But we've seen some evidence to show that as businesses and different employers have switched to being able to work from home or make it even mandatory that you work from home. A lot of folks that might be a bit older maybe don't have the technology to do that. They don't want to do it, maybe don't have the technology savviness to get it done and just feel left out, and maybe that made them leave the labor force as well. The last one I'll say, and I threw this one in here just because, again, I wanted to show the broad scope of changes that are happening. We've seen very large wage increases, probably the largest in modern history over the past 2 years. Across the board, across all occupations and industries. But what's interesting is a lot of those wage increases are coming for the newer labor force that are entering, not so much for folks that maybe have been working for organizations for 25 or 30 years. And so some of those folks maybe have just said, you know what, you're giving the big raises to everybody else, not me. I'm going to retire early. That's some of the stuff we've seen as well. Again, it's going to be a lot of this. So what we've seen, historically low unemployment rates. Folks leaving the labor force, lots of folks retiring, significant demographic changes. This means that we have a lot of job vacancies in the region. Actually, in 2021, the state of Minnesota had 0.4 job seekers per vacancy across the entire state. Essentially, we didn't have a whole body for every job that was available in Minnesota. And it isn't just a statewide issue. We're actually seeing some of the highest job vacancy rates. This is the number of job vacancies as a percentage of the total jobs in the region. These, again, are some of the highest that we've ever seen. So you can see Northeast, Southwest, between 8 and 9% job vacancy rates. We consider 3 to 4% to be a relatively healthy rate. So right down here, that means you have jobs available, but hopefully you have bodies that are also applying for those jobs. to have job vacancy rates that are up around 10% is absolutely crazy. And we have nothing in recorded history to go back on. There is no earlier kind of time in which we can say, oh, we've done this before and this is what works well during these times. We honestly don't have that. So this is what we're going to be talking about, is this fundamental shift that's taking place in economic development, where the 1970s and economic development was all about, how do we recruit, businesses in to open more jobs. It was kind of that if there's jobs, people will come kind of mentality. That's been since the 1970s to now talking about, okay, we have the jobs, we don't have the people, right? And not having the people can also mean employers aren't going to move into your region because they look at your workforce numbers and they say, you know what, we don't know if we could hire anyone in your region. So this is a big issue, and this is what a lot of economic developers are talking about. And this has policy implications across the board. We call it, and I took this from the University of Minnesota Extension, if anybody's on board. A lot of folks, they've done a lot of great work in this area, from chasing smokestacks to chasing people, right? So from chasing jobs to chasing people. Where job recruitment and retention used to be about tax incentives, infrastructure investments, and focus on labor force. How many times over the past 5 years have you heard some small town trying to open or grow a industrial park, right? That you don't hear that much anymore. What you probably are starting to hear a lot more about are these types of policies. How are we engaging our high school students and increasing their awareness of career and local opportunities? Maybe we have to talk about housing. Like, how do we make some more affordable housing for folks to be a part of our workforce? Childcare, visitor strategy. We got to talk about healthcare, current resident engagement, investments in natural amenities. These are the things that economic developers are thinking about now. And I admit it's an uncomfortable situation. And so this part one, I just kind of wanted to set the baseline that we are in a new era, that the idea that there are job shortages is just not the case anymore. We have people shortages, and the way that we talk about our jobs and talk about our economic availability or our opportunity is very different today than it was 20 years ago. And it's okay that we're struggling with these ideas. We're having a lot of conversation around it because this has been a sudden shift, and it's a big shift. And like I said, it's uncomfortable and unprecedented. So,
can you talk about some of the interesting examples that are happening in Greater Minnesota about where communities are approaching this in a constructive and good way?
Sure. We will here in just a bit be talking about engaging high school students. And so there's a lot of work going into career and technical education and things like that. And that's kind of fun to see. And I've been excited about some of those. But one of the other strategies that I'm always interested in is resident recruitment and engagement. Mm-hmm. So how are rural areas setting themselves up to promote the areas to be great places to live and work and try and recruit folks to their neighborhood? I have to give, so Live Wide Open out in West Central Minnesota, as well as Otter Tail County, they have a couple programs set up. Even I will throw some props out to Otter Tail County, where the county commissioners there actually started and created a position called a Rural Rebound Coordinator, mm-hmm. where all this individual does is go out and promote the area, take video, interview folks, talk about jobs, housing, really trying to promote the region as like this cool place to live and to work, and really putting that out there so folks can see it. As well as them now, that county getting behind and saying, you know what, we're going to build a bunch of housing. We're going for 5,000 units, I think, over the next 5 years or something like that. It was this huge goal, and I just got to have a huge amount of respect on that, that they're kind of leading that effort. And I know other counties are doing something similar, but they really put their foot forward and say, this is where we're going in that region. So folks, if anybody's from Otter Tail County, please comment in the chat, and it'd be great to hear from you.
One more question. What can we do? I know people on here will be like, okay, this is great information. What can we do to help decision makers understand that it's no longer a job recruitment issue, but a people recruitment? How do we best approach that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways. So we have to understand that it's going to be a little tough, particularly for some of our leaders that are a little bit older, that have lived through literal decades of job shortage mentality, right? Like that has been our go-to default basis for a long time in our thinking. And so it's going to take a lot of conversation. It's going to be constant messaging. But I think more powerfully, if it comes from businesses, and that's where you're starting to see a lot of really interesting work, is that businesses are starting to realize that we need to recruit people, we need to increase our labor force. And when businesses are saying it, that holds a lot of weight. And so when you're talking and you want to start some of these programs and you're looking to get support for it and you have businesses involved, invite your local legislators, invite your decision makers to come in a meeting with those businesses, because that adds a lot of, like, it's sad, but a lot of legitimacy. Economic arguments, for whatever reason, go a long ways in policy conversations.